Welcome, the anointed ones. The most dangerous thing you can ever give someone is access without oversight. Because people don't abuse power first, they abuse proximity. Most people think betrayal is loud. They imagine shouting, explosions, dramatic exits, and clear villains. But that's not how it actually happens. The real damage usually comes wrapped in familiarity, jokes, shared routines, and "don't worry, I've got you." That's why the truth, when it finally surfaces, doesn't just hurt. It rearranges your memory. You don't just feel wronged, you feel re-educated about your own past. Here's a quiet fact that doesn't get talked about enough. Psychologists have long noted that the people who cause the deepest emotional harm are rarely strangers. They're the ones who had consistent access to your attention, your trust, and your emotional bandwidth. Not because they were powerful, but because they were close. Closeness lowers defenses faster than authority ever could. And once defenses are down, almost anything can pass through unnoticed, including manipulation wearing a friendly face. That's why, when the full story finally clicks, the reaction isn't sadness first. It's disbelief. You replay conversations, jokes, small moments you brushed off, and suddenly they're no longer harmless. They line up, they make sense, and that's when the sentence forms in your mind. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with terrifying calm. If I had known this earlier, I would have walked away without saying a word. What makes it even darker is the irony. The very traits that made you trustworthy, patient, and understanding were the same traits that made the situation last longer than it should have. You didn't ignore red flags because you were blind. You ignored them because you were human, because you believed context mattered, because you assumed decency was mutual. That assumption alone has cost people years of their lives, and no one puts that on a resume. And here's the slightly uncomfortable, slightly funny part. Once clarity hits, you don't even feel the urge to argue anymore. No long explanations, no dramatic confrontations, just a quiet internal laugh like, wow. I was really out here giving VIP access to someone who should have been stuck in the waiting room. This isn't a story about grudges, it's a story about context. Because if you knew the whole story, not the version you were told, not the version they perform, but the unedited one, you wouldn't feel angry, you'd feel finished. Number one, they didn't misunderstand you, they edited you. What hurts the most isn't that they got you wrong. It's that they knew enough about you to change the story on purpose. Misunderstanding is accidental. Editing is deliberate. They listened closely, remembered selectively, and then retold your life with pieces missing, the parts that made them uncomfortable, accountable, or exposed. What people ended up hearing wasn't you. It was a version of you that made them look better. This is why defending yourself always felt exhausting. You weren't correcting a mistake. You were fighting a narrative that had already been packaged and distributed. Once a story is edited, facts don't land the same way anymore. Context disappears. Motives get twisted. Your reactions get highlighted while their actions are quietly removed from the frame. Suddenly you look emotional, difficult, or confusing, and they look patient, concerned, and misunderstood. That didn't happen by accident. They knew which moments to repeat and which ones to bury. They replayed your weakest days and skipped over the days you were calm, clear, and fair. They framed your boundaries as attitude and your exhaustion as instability. Editing works because it doesn't lie outright. It rearranges. And rearranged truth is harder to challenge than a blatant lie. This is also why you felt this deep internal frustration you couldn't explain. On the surface, everything sounded almost accurate, but something felt off. That's because edited stories still contain truth, just not the whole thing. And partial truth is powerful enough to convince people while still betraying you. The hardest realization is that some people don't want clarity. They want control over perception. Editing your story allowed them to stay comfortable while you carried the confusion. They didn't want resolution. They wanted dominance over how events would be remembered. Once you see this, something shifts. You stop trying to explain yourself to people who only know the edited version. You understand that your peace was never going to come from being understood by them. It comes from refusing to participate in a story that was never told honestly in the first place. They didn't misunderstand you. They rewrote you. Number 2. They studied your pain longer than they studied their own healing. Some people don't just notice your struggles. They memorize them. They track your weaknesses, your fears, the moments you stumbled, and the times you hesitated. They don't do it out of care or concern. They do it because knowing your vulnerabilities gives them power. While you were trying to recover, move forward, or just survive, they were quietly taking notes, learning exactly where to push, when to appear sympathetic, and when to disappear entirely. This isn't happenstance. This is precision. And it's exhausting to realize that the person you trusted had a manual on how to hurt you. What makes it even more insidious is that they weren't necessarily cruel all the time. They blended kindness with manipulation, making the harm feel intermittent, unpredictable, and almost impossible to call out. You might have blamed yourself for being sensitive or overreacting because the pain wasn't constant. It was calculated. They weren't being cruel by accident. They were being cruel with the patience of someone who had rehearsed every step in advance. They knew which moments would break your composure and which would leave you questioning your own judgment. By the time the truth finally hits, you realize how much energy you wasted on trying to protect them or explain yourself. You were running in circles, defending your feelings to someone who had already decided how to interpret them. They weren't just observing, they were mapping, anticipating, and exploiting. Every weakness you exposed became a blueprint, and every moment of trust became a doorway. Understanding this changes how you interact with people forever. You stop expecting empathy where there was none, and stop giving space to those who only see you as a resource for their own comfort. You learn that survival isn't just about endurance. It's about recognizing the pattern of observation, knowing when you've been studied, and choosing not to remain an open book for someone who only reads you to manipulate you. They didn't fail to understand your pain. They learned it more thoroughly than they ever learned themselves. Number 3, they needed you confused so they could stay comfortable. Confusion isn't always a byproduct. It's a tool. Some people rely on your uncertainty the way others rely on air. The more unsure you are about what happened, why it happened, or how you feel about it, the easier it is for them to maintain control. They don't need to convince you of anything outright. They just need you to keep questioning yourself, replaying conversations, wondering if you misunderstood, if you overreacted, if you're too sensitive. That cycle of doubt keeps you spinning in place while they remain comfortably unchanged. It's subtle, almost invisible. It comes in vague explanations, contradictory actions, and just enough validation to make you second-guess your instincts. They don't give you clarity because clarity is dangerous to them. Once the fog lifts, your perspective is unshakable, and suddenly the balance of power flips. They aren't threatened by your silence, your anger, or even your departure. They're threatened by your certainty. Confusion keeps you compliant. Clarity makes them accountable. You start noticing it in retrospect. The small inconsistencies that didn't add up. The excuses that never made sense. The way they seemed offended whenever you tried to ask for clarity. Every interaction was designed to keep the story incomplete, to keep your perception in a state of suspension. It wasn't random. It wasn't because they were careless. It was calculated to preserve their comfort at your expense. Once you see this clearly, something clicks. You realize that your frustration wasn't about missing information. It was about the manipulation behind keeping you in the dark. You stop wasting energy trying to reconcile the contradictions, stop apologizing for your confusion, and stop expecting honesty where it was never intended. They weren't disorganized. They weren't inconsistent by mistake. They needed your confusion because their comfort depended on it. And understanding that is the moment the fog finally starts to lift. Number 4, they punished you for noticing patterns. Some people can't handle the truth, especially when it's reflected back in ways they can't deny. Every time you started connecting dots, noticing repetitions, or understanding the rhythm of their behavior, the environment shifted. You weren't overthinking. You weren't imagining things. You were seeing the structure of their actions, the blueprint they hoped you'd never recognize, and that recognition became your crime. They didn't lash out randomly. They reacted precisely to your awareness. If you noticed their excuses, they would escalate. If you recognized their lies, they would distract. If you saw the cycle they relied on to control situations, they would gaslight. Every time you started understanding, their subtle punishments followed. The goal wasn't to hurt you physically, it was to make noticing feel unsafe. Awareness threatened the illusion they had built, and the more you saw, the more dangerous you became in their eyes. This punishment wasn't always loud or obvious. It came as cold shoulders, silent treatments, passive aggression, and micro-manipulations. It came as invalidation of your perception, framing your insights as overreactions, sensitivity, or paranoia. They punished you in ways that made you question your mind, your memory, your judgment. They turned your intelligence into a liability, something to be managed, minimized, or punished for daring to exist. Over time, it becomes exhausting. You start questioning your own instincts because every time you trusted them, you were met with resistance, dismissal, or distortion. They relied on the hope that repeated subtle punishment would erode your pattern recognition, that you would stop noticing long enough for them to regain control. The bitter truth is that noticing patterns was never a flaw. It was your power, and their punishment was proof that you were seeing clearly. Every uncomfortable consequence of awareness is a signal that you've peeled back a layer they intended to keep hidden. They didn't punish you because you were wrong. They punished you because you were right, and right terrified them. Number 5, they turned your empathy into their hiding place. Empathy is a gift, but some people treat it like a loophole. They rely on your ability to understand, forgive, and see the complexity in everyone, not because they respect it, but because it gives them cover. Every time you extended patience, offered a second chance, or hesitated to call them out, they counted it as permission. Your compassion became a shield for their actions, a way to operate without accountability. They knew you would look for reasons before you looked for exits, and that hesitation allowed them to stay comfortable while continuing behavior that would have been unacceptable under scrutiny. It's subtle. They don't hit you with obvious lies or betrayals right away. Instead, they layer your own kindness into their strategy. They appeal to your fairness, your desire to see the good in people, and your reluctance to make a scene. Your empathy becomes a tool that works in their favor without them having to force anything. You give them the benefit of the doubt, and in return, they take it. The moments when you doubt your instincts or blame yourself, that's them capitalizing on your decency. The worst part is how convincing it feels in real time. They are skilled at mixing truth with manipulation, showing flashes of vulnerability or regret that make your empathy feel like the right response. You want to help them because that's who you are, but every act of care slowly teaches them that consequences aren't necessary. They don't fear your boundaries because your empathy has trained them to expect leniency. Eventually, the realization hits. Your very ability to understand became a hiding place for someone who never intended to be seen honestly. They relied on your compassion to cover their negligence, dishonesty, or selfishness. The moments you spent trying to decode them, justify them, or save them weren't wasted because they reveal your strength. They were wasted on someone who never deserved your insight. They didn't see your empathy as a strength. They saw it as a vault where they could hide, protected by your willingness to care. Number 6, they used proximity, not power, to harm you. Harm doesn't always come from someone in charge. Most of the time, it comes from people who are close enough to see your routines, know your habits, and understand your boundaries, but who don't respect them. They didn't need titles, authority, or control to impact your life. They only needed access. They operated in the spaces where you felt safe, in the moments where your guard was naturally down, and in the environments you assumed were neutral. That's why it's so insidious, because it feels normal until the pattern becomes undeniable. The danger of proximity is that it creates a false sense of security. You trust people because they are consistently present. You assume that familiarity equals goodwill. But they weaponized that trust. Every time you shared a detail, extended patience, or relied on them, they gained data, leverage, and influence. The harm wasn't sudden. It was cumulative, almost imperceptible at first, but devastating over time. They didn't need grand gestures or explosive arguments. Small actions repeated in the right way were enough to manipulate, undermine, or destabilize you. This is why outsiders often don't see it. From the outside, the relationship looks ordinary, even friendly. There are no obvious violations, no dramatic confrontations, no explosive betrayals. The harm happens quietly, in the gaps, in the unnoticed moments. It thrives on your natural instincts to trust, to give benefit of the doubt, to assume people who are near you are aligned with your well-being. That's why, when the truth becomes clear, it feels like a shock. How could someone so close cause so much chaos? Recognizing this changes how you view connection forever. It makes you protective of your space, selective with your attention, and cautious about who earns proximity. It teaches you that power isn't always visible, and that influence is often more dangerous than authority. They didn't need to dominate you with force. They needed access, and proximity gave them the perfect weapon. Number 7, they resented your integrity because they couldn't borrow it. Integrity isn't something you can hand over. It can't be borrowed, faked, or temporarily worn like a costume. And that's exactly why some people can't stand it when they see it in you. They resent it because it exposes the shortcuts they've taken, the compromises they've justified, and the lies they've told themselves to feel okay. Your consistency, honesty, and refusal to bend to manipulation shined a spotlight on everything they were avoiding. They didn't attack you for being difficult. They attacked you for being real in a world where they were not. This resentment often shows up in ways that feel confusing. They'll test you, push your limits, or subtly challenge your values, hoping you'll cave. Every time you hold firm, they're reminded that your strength is unavailable for them to use. That unyielding quality in you becomes a mirror they'd rather break than face. Unlike many forms of conflict, this isn't about disagreement. It's about your very presence as a standard they cannot reach. They feel exposed, not because you did anything, but because your integrity refuses to accommodate their shortcuts. The irony is sharp. Your reliability, fairness, and self-respect, which they envy and resent, are exactly what keeps you sane and balanced in chaotic spaces. Meanwhile, they rely on manipulation, bending truths, and convenience to navigate life. Seeing someone operate differently threatens them, because it's impossible to manipulate the consequences of their actions when someone else is anchored in reality. Your ethics and clarity make their evasions and deceptions obvious, which makes them uncomfortable in ways they can't articulate. Eventually, you realize the resentment isn't personal in the conventional sense. It's about control. They wanted access to your steadiness, your honesty, your moral backbone, without putting in the work themselves. Your integrity couldn't be borrowed, or diminished, and that made you untouchable in a way that terrified them. They didn't resent you for what you did. They resented you for what you were, because they could never replicate it. And that truth shook them in silence. Number 8, they feared your memory more than your voice. Some people think the danger lies in what you say, but the real threat is in what you remember. Memories are permanent, unfiltered records of reality, and they don't require dramatics to wield. They don't fade when manipulated. They stay sharp, precise, and inconveniently honest. That's why certain people fear your recollection more than your complaints. They know that if your memory is intact, no lie, excuse, or distortion can survive scrutiny. Your memory alone can dismantle the carefully constructed narrative they spent years protecting. They weren't worried about what you would tell others because, in their mind, words can be controlled, ignored, or dismissed. But memory is different. Memory is internal evidence that can't be silenced or rewritten. Every subtle manipulation, every betrayal, every hidden motive, you remember it. And that terrifies them, because you don't need proof in a traditional sense. You already have the timeline, the context, and the awareness that they hoped you'd forget. Every casual conversation you recall, every incident you recount in your mind, becomes a threat to the story they want the world to hear. This is why gaslighting, blame shifting, and confusion tactics are so common around people like this. They try to make you doubt your own recollection, to cloud the clarity that makes you untouchable. They push the narrative that you're overreacting, imagining things, or misremembering, because if they can make you question your memory, they regain some control. But as long as your memory is sharp, the truth exists quietly but firmly, waiting for the moment you decide to act, speak, or simply walk away. And when you finally recognize it, there's a kind of quiet satisfaction. They never realized that memory is a weapon you didn't need to brandish. It's a silent ledger that keeps the balance of reality intact, regardless of their attempts to rewrite it. They didn't fear your voice. They feared your memory, because it holds the unchangeable story of everything they thought they could hide. Number 9, they wanted access to your light, without responsibility for your wounds. Some people love what you bring into a room, but they have no interest in what it cost you to carry it. They enjoy your warmth, your energy, your perspective, your humor, your resilience. They show up for the benefits, not the burden. They want the results of your healing without acknowledging the injuries that forced you to heal in the first place. That's why their presence feels conditional. They are comfortable as long as you stay bright, steady, and useful. The moment your wounds surface, their interest fades. They treat your strength like it appeared out of nowhere, as if you woke up one day confident, wise, and composed. They skip the chapters where you were broken, exhausted, and figuring things out alone. And because they skip those chapters, they feel entitled to the version of you that survived them. They want your patience, but not your pain, your insight, but not your boundaries, your loyalty, but not your needs. It's consumption disguised as connection. This is where the imbalance becomes clear. You're expected to show up whole, forgiving, and understanding, while your history is treated as an inconvenience. When your wounds show, they call it too much. When you set limits to protect those wounds, they call it distance. They admire your light but resent the maintenance it requires. They don't want to be present for the hard moments because those moments demand empathy, accountability, and effort. Eventually, you realize how lonely that kind of access is. Being appreciated only for what you provide, not for what you've endured, drains you. You start to feel like a resource instead of a person, and the clarity hits. Anyone who benefits from your light while dismissing your wounds is not connected to you. They're attached to what you give. They never wanted to carry your pain. They just wanted the glow that came from surviving it, without honoring the cost that made it possible. Number 10, they mistook your endurance for permission. Endurance is not weakness, but some people can't tell the difference. They see your ability to survive, tolerate, and navigate hardship, and assume it means you're available for anything, that you have endless capacity for their demands, their mistakes, their manipulation. Every compromise you made, every moment you held back anger, every time you swallowed your frustration, they read as a green light. They thought your patience was a contract, a guarantee that you would absorb everything without consequence. They confused survival with consent, and that miscalculation cost you more than you realized at the time. This is why endurance is dangerous in the hands of someone unworthy. The more they tested your limits, the more they believed those limits didn't exist. They didn't see the quiet strength it took to keep going. They only saw the result, the calm, the tolerance, the ability to function under strain. And instead of respecting that, they assumed it was their right to push further. They relied on the assumption that you would continue, that your endurance would protect them from the accountability they refused to face. Eventually, the miscalculation becomes obvious. The moment endurance stops being silent, the moment clarity replaces tolerance, is the moment they realize they've been wrong. Your strength was never theirs to take. Your patience was never permission. They counted on your ability to withstand everything because they never imagined a world where you would refuse. The tragedy is that endurance often invites more strain before the lesson becomes visible. It's cumulative, invisible in real time, and it feels like you're managing chaos alone. But that same endurance that seemed to encourage abuse is the exact quality that allows you to survive it and emerge unbroken. It's what makes the final detachment so undeniable. They mistook your endurance for weakness. They mistook your tolerance for agreement. And that's the moment they discovered that what they relied on was never theirs to exploit. Number 11, they needed you doubting yourself so they wouldn't have to change. The most convenient tool for someone unwilling to face their flaws is your self-doubt. As long as you questioned yourself, hesitated, or second-guessed your instincts, they never had to. They could continue the same behavior, repeat the same patterns, and avoid accountability entirely because you were too busy trying to reconcile your perception with their version of reality. Your uncertainty became the perfect cover, the invisible armor that let them operate without reflection or responsibility. They manipulate situations so that you always feel a step behind. Every contradictory statement, every subtle inconsistency, every quiet dismissal is a trap designed to make you question your memory, your reasoning, and your worth. The moment you start to trust yourself again, their comfort disappears. They count on your internal chaos to maintain theirs. Your self-doubt is not a flaw on your part. It's a weapon they wield to preserve their freedom to behave without consequence. This is why you often feel exhausted around them. You replay scenarios in your head endlessly, trying to understand what went wrong, wondering if you misread their intentions. Meanwhile, they don't feel that strain because their energy is spent avoiding insight. They don't have to consider your perspective, reconcile with their mistakes, or confront the harm they've caused. Your mental and emotional labor is doing the work that they refuse to do. The irony is sharp. The more they rely on your doubt, the more obvious their unwillingness to change becomes. You start to see the pattern, and the truth becomes undeniable. The discomfort you feel isn't your failure. It's theirs. Your uncertainty was the veil that allowed them to stay unchanged, while everything around you shifted. Once you step out from behind that veil and reclaim your clarity, you leave them exposed, naked in the truth they've been avoiding. They didn't need to argue with you. They didn't need to defend themselves. They needed you doubting yourself so they could avoid the one thing they feared most: change. Number 12. They weren't shocked by your exit. They were shocked you saw them. The moment you leave isn't always the moment that surprises someone who's been manipulating or betraying you. They expect departures eventually. It's inevitable. What really throws them off is realizing you were aware all along. They counted on your confusion, your tolerance, and your willingness to rationalize their behavior. They assumed you wouldn't see patterns, motives, or the repeated manipulations, and they never imagined you would connect the dots before it was too late. Your awareness was the betrayal they never prepared for. They move through life carefully crafting how they're perceived, masking intentions with charm, vulnerability, or reasonableness. They don't anticipate transparency because transparency threatens their carefully maintained narrative. They rely on people not noticing, not remembering fully, not drawing lines. And when you do notice, when you do remember, when you do act, it exposes the illusion. That exposure is what they fear, not confrontation itself, but the certainty that comes from someone finally seeing clearly. The shock isn't loud or dramatic. It's in the shift of their behavior, the sudden tension in their voice, the way they stumble over excuses they thought they had rehearsed. It's the realization that the person they tried to manipulate, disorient, and control wasn't blind. Your clarity rewrites the dynamic entirely. The power they assumed they had disappears the moment you step out with full awareness. This is why, when people finally walk away from someone who thrived on control and deception, it feels like liberation. It's not just leaving a toxic environment. It's asserting that your observation, your insight, and your perception matter more than the illusion they tried to enforce. The departure isn't the punishment. It's the recognition that you were awake all along. They weren't worried about your absence. They were terrified that you had been watching, understanding, and remembering the whole time. And that is the moment they realized their control was an illusion, shattered by your eyes wide open. Number 13. They depended on your silence, not your forgiveness. Forgiveness is overrated in the eyes of manipulators. What they really want is your silence. They don't need you to let go of anger or resentment. They need you to stay quiet, to keep the truth hidden, and to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. Your willingness to speak up threatens the story they've spent time carefully constructing, so they rely on your discretion, your patience, and the hope that you'll internalize the harm instead of exposing it. Silence is the only thing that protects them, and they depend on it far more than any act of forgiveness you could offer. Every act of suppression, every time you rationalized their behavior or shrugged off their inconsistencies, reinforced their sense of security. They know that forgiveness alone doesn't erase facts, but your silence does. As long as you stay quiet, their actions can be retold, reframed, or erased in public perception. You holding your tongue becomes a cover for their truth, a shield that allows them to operate without facing consequences. They're not concerned about your emotional healing. They're concerned about the narrative they've built that keeps them comfortable. This is why speaking out feels like such a radical act. It's not about revenge, loud confrontations, or dramatics. It's about reclaiming what they assumed they could control. Every time you stop internalizing their manipulation, every time you document, remember, or share your truth, you take away their advantage. Silence is what they relied on, and once it's gone, the foundation of their control crumbles. The irony is stark. Forgiveness often keeps people trapped in cycles of abuse, but your voice liberates you. They counted on you to absorb, excuse, and forget. They didn't anticipate that eventually you would recognize that your silence was their greatest weapon and choose not to hand it over. They didn't rely on you letting go of anger. They relied on you staying quiet. and your decision to speak is the moment their comfort ends. Number 14. If the full story came out, their image wouldn't survive it. Some people invest more energy in protecting their image than in living honestly. They carefully craft the version of themselves the world sees, choosing which moments to highlight, which mistakes to excuse, and which truths to hide. They don't fear exposure because they've been caught before. They fear exposure because the full story is too damaging to contain. If every detail, every manipulation, every inconsistency were revealed, the persona they've relied on would collapse instantly. That's why so much effort goes into controlling perception. The stakes are survival, not reputation, and the slightest crack in the narrative is a threat they cannot afford. The danger isn't just embarrassment, it's accountability. The full story doesn't just reveal flaws, it shows intent, pattern, and repetition. Every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal becomes undeniable, connected, and impossible to dismiss. Once the public, or even a close circle, sees the truth unedited, the carefully constructed version of themselves can't survive scrutiny. The image they presented depended entirely on selective memory and omission, and the full story dismantles that foundation entirely. They act quickly to control the narrative, not because they've done nothing wrong, but because they know that being fully seen would erase the advantage they've spent years building. Every attempt to rewrite history, discredit your perspective, or justify their behavior is a desperate act of damage control. They understand at a fundamental level that exposure equals consequence, and consequence equals collapse. This is why clarity in your own perception is so dangerous to them. They fear not your anger, your complaints, or even your departure. They fear the truth remembered, documented, and shared. Your recognition of the entire story is the ultimate threat, because it doesn't need dramatics to have power. Its existence alone shatters the illusion they've carefully maintained. They didn't fear judgment from the world. They feared the world seeing what they truly were. And if the full story came out, the image they spent a lifetime polishing would be gone forever. Conclusion. If you've followed this story closely, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. What seems like ordinary behavior, minor betrayals, or simple misunderstandings was never ordinary. Every detail, every interaction, every silent calculation was part of a pattern that wasn't just meant to inconvenience you. It was designed to control, manipulate, and keep you from seeing clearly. From rewriting your story, to studying your pain, to weaponizing your empathy, every move was strategic. They counted on your endurance, your patience, and even your forgiveness to shield themselves from accountability. And through it all, they believed your silence would protect them, your confusion would comfort them, and your memory would fail before their actions were exposed. But here's the undeniable truth. You saw it. You noticed. You endured. You remembered. You questioned. You stayed alert when they assumed you would collapse under the weight of their deception. And every tactic they used to manipulate or control you only proves one thing. Your clarity was always the threat. The moment you recognize the full scope of what was done, you step out of the narrative they tried to trap you in. You stop giving power to people who never deserved it, and you reclaim the story of your own life, unedited and unbent. The power in all of this isn't in anger, revenge, or retaliation. It's in awareness, discernment, and action. Understanding the depth of manipulation doesn't make you bitter. It makes you untouchable. It allows you to recognize who truly deserves your energy and who was never worthy of it in the first place. This is the moment where your liberation begins, not through confrontation, but through seeing clearly, remembering fully, and refusing to participate in lies that were never yours to carry. If this video gave you clarity, if it revealed truths that you felt but couldn't name, make sure to honor your own awareness. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss content that exposes the unseen, like this video. Share it with someone who needs to see it, and leave a comment to let us know what truth hit you the hardest. Your story, your insight, and your voice matter, and it's time the world recognizes it. God bless you.